526 million. Now, you may think this is just a number, but that's the number of people in the world who have been infected with COVID, according to the CDC. In America, there have been over 18 million cases. COVID has affected everyone in one way or another. I mean, come on. At this point, I think we all know someone who has had COVID or currently has COVID. Hi, my name is Peter, and today we'll be discussing the effects of COVID, more in particular, how it affected the supply chain and the military. For our first thing, we're going to talk about how COVID affected military recruiting. We have Staff Sergeant Michael Woolworth, who has been a Marine for 9 years and 2 years as a recruiter. So he has experienced trying to recruit people through COVID, and he has gone through all of the hardships. Before we get into this interview, let's go over a little bit of general information. There's around 1,417,370 active duty military personnel and about 857,261 reserve personnel. Of those personnel, around 1,678,422 members are fully vaccinated. So how did COVID really affect you?
Well, it was interesting because I actually came out on recruiting about 3 months prior to COVID. So there was no protocols or anything when I got taught how to be a recruiter. So when COVID came out, as I was learning it on the job for the first 3 months, it was definitely pretty out of nowhere, and it definitely caught me by surprise. So it was definitely interesting to be that early in recruiting whenever COVID first happened.
When COVID first started, everyone was afraid of COVID. People were wearing their masks outside, schools were shutting down, and that would especially affect recruiting to the point where they would have to wear plexiglass shields. Before the vaccine, it was completely different. People were afraid to come in because they were afraid of getting sick. And that has a huge impact on when you're trying to recruit people. If you can't get them to come in, how are you going to try and recruit people?
So with recruiting specifically, a lot of it was because in the initial stages of COVID, there was severe limitations on face-to-face interactions within any government facility. So as far as processing applicants to join the United States military, it actually pretty close came to a halt. It didn't stop altogether, but it became very difficult because the face-to-face interactions were very limited, and it was just trying to keep up logistically with getting the masks and getting the plexiglass shields and all that kind of stuff. Most of our work for a while there was done virtually. We would have virtual appointments. We would meet people over Skype and Zoom, and then whenever interactions only took place whenever the process was much further along.
One thing that was interesting is when recruits would arrive to basic training,
recruits would stay in a hotel room in quarantine for 2 weeks prior to basic training.
So the reason these recruits would stay in a hotel room for 2 weeks before basic training is because they had to quarantine them to make sure that none of these recruits showed symptoms. Because if they do that, then they don't have to wear the masks and enforce it, because everyone did wait that 2 weeks before they came in. You know if they're requiring everyone to get the vaccine?
They are. Everybody that's in the United States military is required to get the vaccine.
So according to a study from Center for Strategic International Studies, it said the death rate for military personnel was only 1 out of 130 people, usually about like a 0.15% fatality rate. Was there any fear really when COVID first hit among soldiers that you'd get it?
Not so much. I know with all of the fears with COVID, usually there's a lot of underlying conditions that also factor into at-risk individuals. And typically when it comes to the Marine Corps, we have extremely high levels of physical fitness. We have extreme standards when it comes to body fat percentages and all that kind of stuff. And we're also some of the younger portions of society. So we're typically between 20 and 30 years old. So generally somebody who's between 20 and 30 years old within good physical standards has a lower risk of, not necessarily catching COVID, but experiencing some of the more extreme effects of COVID. So most of the people, it's not as if they didn't fear it, but they just weren't controlled by that fear, if that makes sense.
Before the vaccine, it was completely different. People were afraid to come in because they were afraid of getting sick. And that has a huge impact on when you're trying to recruit people. If you can't get them to come in, how are you going to try and recruit people? So if you have any interest in joining the military, please contact your local recruiter, no matter what branch you want to join. Even if you're older, maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're an English teacher, and you're in the high 30s, you can still join the military. Now we're going to change gears into how COVID affected the supply chain. Today we have Professor Panos Gouvelis with us, who is a teacher at Washington University for their School of Business. Prior to joining Washington University, Panos Gouvelis served as an associate professor at the Fuqua School of Business and at Duke University, and is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He published 3 books and over 80 papers in top quality academic journals. So the first question I would like to ask you is, we all know that supply chain issues are not new, and various corporations have faced supply chain issues. Since we live in a global-based economy based on manufacturing, do you feel that COVID is the main reason for our current global supply chain is currently disrupted?
Well, the last 3 years, of course, COVID contributed significantly in the supply chain problems. But supply chain problems have always been there for various reasons, but I believe the COVID situation accentuated all of these challenges and shortages that we encountered. I can get into more detail if you want, but we have seen different effects. So when you start basically in 2020, in around March of 2020, at that point in time, as China started shutting down its manufacturing, then obviously supply chains got immediately affected. But now when you come into 2022, COVID is affecting us in a very different way. The zero COVID policy in China is forcing lockdowns. The last 6 weeks, Shanghai is locked down, which again has slowed down all of the logistics within China, as well as some of the manufacturing. So the COVID affects in different ways the supply chain over the last 3 years, and that's something I would like to emphasize.
So what basically is going on is these factories and these other manufacturers, they can't get employees because of COVID, so that completely slows everything down. They aren't making the products. That means the products go up in value, and there's a lot less of them. For the future, we don't know what the future is going to hold. I mean, we can make some predictions for how the supply chain is going to be affected, but based off many factors like the Ukrainian war, we really don't know.
It is really hard to say if it gets better. It really depends. So as I emphasized at this point in time, the 2 significant unknowns in the world is the situation in China and the lockdowns and how much they will be able to control the Omicron variant. With the zero COVID policy, it looks like right now they have controlled somewhat the situation in Shanghai, somewhat is controlled in Beijing, but the Omicron variant transmits very easily. So therefore, it's not unlikely that we're going to have more lockdowns. And if that is the situation, then obviously we'll ripple through the supply chains. Then the Ukraine war creates certain challenges in certain parts of the world. It doesn't affect us as much in the North America, but can affect supply chains. The supply chains is constrained resources, and we uncovered that the demand came back much faster after 2020, much higher than anybody expected, and exceeded the level of resources we have, especially on shipping and tracking and some of the warehouse capacity and some of the capacity of our ports. Some of those constraints might remain there if the demand continues to stay strong. But in the current environment, with the economy potentially slowing down, that is something very hard to say. The inflation being significant, the Federal Reserve tightening the belt, the demand can slow down. If the demand slowed down, situation for the supply chain will get better. But at the same time, it's not something that I'm wishing, because slowing down demand might mean we're getting into an economic recession.
So according to Fortune.com, it appears in 2023 we are going to have an economic recession because the economy is starting to slow down. This is going to extremely affect the supply chain because that demand is going to get lower. Thank you for listening to my podcast. Now, the 2 main things I want you to take away is join the military and buy more stuff to keep the economy going. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.